Within Cataclysm, we were told that we would get the Abyssal Maw as a raid during the first patch. What is the Abyssal Maw? Well, during the quest and experience of one of the first zones of the expansion, Vashjr has you eventually wander to a whirlpool leading to the Abyssal Maw, a portal to the elemental plane of water. And there, we fight various creatures of the Old God and even try to assist the elemental lord of water himself, Neptulon. But at the end of the fight, we fail, and he's dragged away by a massive kraken.
If we ever have a chance, anytime we deliver a patch, we don't want to leave anyone out. So one of the biggest things is trying to always deliver a 5-player dungeon along with a raid. And patch 4.0 won't be any different, so we're planning to deliver a new dungeon, which would be Abyssal Maw. Abyssal Maw will be a continuation of the story that players are playing through in Vashjr. So in Vashjr, we already have a dungeon that's shipping with Cataclysm, the Throne of the Tides. So players are going to play through that and already get a base of the story of what's going on. And it's the same issue that we're dealing with in Hyjal, where basically you're going to play through the quests all the way through, and when you get into the dungeon, you're going to actually know what's happening. So it's not going to feel like something that's foreign to you. Oh, and it's nothing like Oculus. You're going to see the layout here of what this dungeon looks like, and it's separate areas, like almost like underwater. We've got these risen areas, and players are going to play on these each individual areas, and then they're going to travel from one to the next. So you'll get a view of what that looks like here. We're planning on 4 bosses for this. Anything between 3 and 5 we feel like always feels pretty good for a dungeon. So this is a look at the layout. Same deal here. This is what we start with and how we get things going. So you can see all that blue area is basically like a chasm, because this dungeon takes place underwater. The entire dungeon is similar to our entire first zone of Vashjr. So everything about this will be under the water in the elemental plane of water. And we have a ton of new tech that we're introducing with Cataclysm that helps deal with players being underwater. Whenever you touch the ground, you actually lock to the ground on the bottom. And then playing with your character at that point feels just like you would be on land. So we've done all new animations for the races, so when they walk underwater, they feel like they're actually moving through the water plane. But for you as a player, you're not dealing with odd camera angles or creatures that are swimming above you or 3D, perception issues that might feel weird. So we want to get that vibe and that feeling that players are underwater. But historically, obviously, underwater combat has not been a strong point. So we wanted to make sure that doing something like this didn't affect the gameplay. And I think we can definitely say that we know that's going to work out well because we've already seen it in Vashjr.
This was supposed to lead into the raid, which originally was even supposed to deal with N'Zoth in some way. But the raid was even partially done, and can be found in the files. But after feedback during the beta of how players absolutely hated the underwater combat of the zone, even one underwater boss could be seen as too much for the raid. And while they did like that they could reuse a lot of assets for the raid, making it extremely easy to make, they felt it would pair in comparison to the Firelands. So they eventually just put all the work into the Firelands, putting all the boss numbers that they were going to work on in the Abyssal Maw into the Firelands. And then they just cut out the Abyssal Maw itself. And because it was cut, we didn't actually get to know what happened to him until Legion, when he shows up and we find out that he just kind of escaped himself off screen. Although short, something to mention, Firelands was intended to launch at the start of the expansion, with Skywall, Bastion of Twilight, originally called Grim Batal, which may imply that the dungeon was supposed to be a raid, or the raid itself was supposed to take place there, instead of wherever the portal at the top of the spire teleports you, and Blackwing Descent as shown at the BlizzCon announcement. Deathwing was given a humanoid model that he was supposed to show up in, however, we only ever see this model in-game once, which is with a bunch of drunkards telling stories about their encounters with Deathwing, with one of them telling a story about how they punched Deathwing in the face. Funny enough, as they tell you about his humanoid form, which is seen nowhere else in-game, this could almost act as evidence in his favor that he did in fact punch Deathwing in the face. We did get to see him originally in this form in the Twilight Highlands quest where you and Alexstrasza fought against him, as making him humanoid allowed you a chance to actually fight him. However, when they brought the game to live, they fought in dragon forms, while you were forced to fight a random chromatic dragon instead.
The biggest tie-in with the artifacts, and then this is actually in the end game, is it's going to unlock the potential for your paths, the paths of the Titan, which I think Greg went over in one of his earlier. Okay, we're really not going to talk about that much then, but it gives you more flexibility in that system that you know nothing about. but it's very cool. And secondly, it's going to give you some very cool, unique rewards. Things like vanity pets. You might have a little T-Rex that's, skeleton, or you might have instant travel to a dungeon because you discovered an underground passage.
You're going to be able to get these artifacts and take them to these different world groups that we'll talk about more later that have to do with the different paths of the Titans, and they'll help players advance along the Titan progression. So the Paths of the Titans are a new way for players to kind of customize their characters. The idea here is that while we're doing a whole lot of new talents in the expansion, we aren't actually extending the trees any farther than they are right now. So the 51-point talents that we have now will continue to be the 51-point talents in the expansion. You will get 5 new talent points to spend along the way as you get up to level 85. But rather than deepening the talent trees further, we're going to give you a little bit of a chance to get more points in the talents that we already have right now to make sure you're not stretched too thin. And then introduce the Paths of the Titans, which is a completely new type of advancement. Every player is going to be able to choose which path they want to follow, and they're not limited by class. So one of the interesting things about this system is that a rogue, for example, would be able to choose any one of the paths. So, some rogues might choose one path, others might choose another one. There also might be priests that are choosing the same path. So there are a bunch of new abilities and kind of passive bonuses, that sort of stuff, in each one of those paths that you'll be able to choose between. So it adds kind of another dimension to your character customization.
Path of the Titans was a system that would add a path around the glyph system we had at the time. This system, funny enough, was going to be the first expansion long progression system. Something that's kind of become a norm in WoW ever since Legion. Players would need to first find these special glyphs by doing archaeology, and doing questlines for cults that worship their respective Titan. Power locked behind locking yourself into a specific covenant. Sounds kind of familiar to something we have today. This progression system gave players a choice of a path, each to do with a Titan. These paths would unlock by doing things like questing, raiding, PvP, and even professions, maxing out each week. Then with these special glyph slots, players could insert glyphs of increased ranks, 1 to 10, each rank having 2 to 3 choices at first, with the devs saying it would increase your player's power by about 20% over the entire expansion, which these days seems rather small for an entire expansion system. Although it becomes extremely understandable when you see actually some of the abilities in one of the paths they showed us, Gilneas. For rank 1, we have Earth's Embrace, which reduces physical damage taken by 4%, and Battle Harden, reducing durations of bleeds and stuns by 20%. Rank 2, we have Medic, giving your bandages 30% extra healing, Fortification, a 5-minute buff which reduces nearby allies' damage taken by 10% for 6 seconds. And rank 3, Breakthrough, 5-minute cooldown to increase your damage by 10% for 10 seconds, only usable after you deal a crit. The system was scrapped pretty early on, as that was all we were shown before it just vanished. And with their vanishment, the Path of the Titan system was simply replaced with just the Prime Glyph system, which just acted as second major glyphs, but even stronger. Although most of them were just major glyphs moved up, with new major glyphs created in order to take their place. Something to note, the system sounds almost exactly like the Covenants of Shadowlands. However, the only different thing is there being no cosmetics. But locking yourself to a specific group that affects your power by up to 20%, while also locking it behind quest content that seemingly takes some time, it almost seems like the Path of the Titans might have later been reworked into what we see today in Covenants. Originally, the War of the Ancients dungeon was supposed to be a raid, although what we know of it is extremely minor. But with how much lore significance the War of the Ancients has, and how much effort they obviously put into the dungeon, it's easy to see why they were trying to turn this into a raid.
So Battle for Gilneas is one of those. The idea being that players are going to be able to fight through the city and the streets of Gilneas City and take control of the different districts and fight it out.
Gilneas, as originally shown, was supposed to be a full-on battleground within the city itself, acting almost as a full-on city siege between two factions, maybe even being an epic battleground, as it was still supposed to be a capture point battleground, but within the whole city. And with a city of that size, it would have to require lots of people within it. But what we ended up getting instead was a Arathi Basin 2 Electric Boogaloo with 2 less bases. During Cataclysm, a player made a request about Warlock pets, asking for the possibility of an incubi. For those of you who don't know, the Sayad is a race of demons found within the Burning Legion. The ones we see of them are all females, the succubi, but there is a theoretical male version called the incubi, However, with little references to them, there's no models or official artwork made for them outside of some possible concept art. Players have wished to see these demons for a long time, and after so much request, one of the community managers responded to the ever-growing thread saying that Blizzard had plans to soon offer a choice between male and female versions of all Warlock demons. Although with no time frame given, and it being over 10 years later, I'm pretty sure they scrapped the idea.
Our plan is actually to have 3 battlegrounds with the expansion. So one of those things that we want to do in terms of adding more in-game content than we've had before is to add more battlegrounds than we've ever had in the past.
Speaking of battlegrounds, there was originally supposed to be 3 with Cataclysm. However, the third one never came out, where you would push carts in a mining-based battleground within Stranglethorn jungle, a diamond mine. Planned seemingly even since vanilla, it was a key point marked on the early location map in the Warcraft diary. You would think this place never came out, but it did. Silver Shard Mines, one of the 2 battlegrounds that released in Pandaria, was originally going to be released in Cataclysm, shown as a Cataclysm battleground where it worked pretty much the same as it does now, except a slightly different shape, and with the rocks that could be attacked to block paths for a bit. And it makes so much sense too. The entire mine looks nothing like Pandaria, especially with the mass amount of goblin architecture, rocks that look straight out of Deepholm, and of course the literal troll ruins that were just copy-pasted models from Stranglethorn. Whatever happened to this place that made it get delayed for an entire 2 years, it likely had to do with those rocks, as creating collision where players are nearby can be difficult to get to work right.
So Deepholm is like Tom was trying to explain, it's not actually connected to Azeroth, it's in the elemental plane of Earth. The connection that it has to Azeroth is where Deathwing actually broke through the ceiling and actually came into Azeroth, thereby causing the Cataclysm. And players will actually be able to use that scar left on the Earth on Azeroth as an actual way to get back and forth into Deepholm. So here you can see a little schematic of the layout of what we're planning for Deepholm. There in the center is the Temple of Earth, which is actually it's an important place in Deepholm. It's a central location. It's now overrun by Twilight's Hammer, and that's basically where Deathwing was kind of nursed back to bring him back to the state of what he needed to be to break back into Azeroth and cause the Cataclysm.
Deepholm lore-wise is where Deathwing was held, with its portal being within the Maelstrom, until he was able to break free and cause the Cataclysm, even though the amazing cinematic showed him coming out of some random mountain, seemingly near the Barrens.
So Deepholm is a subterranean looking environment, so it's almost going to feel like an enclosed cave, but it's huge. As far as scale goes, it's probably the biggest zone that we're building for Cataclysm, especially since it's going to be the hub of all 5 of the new zones. We're going to allow flying in there, even though it's going to feel like an interior. You're going to be able to fly with your flying mount. As we mentioned, this is basically after Deathwing kind of went crazy, ended up here, and this is where you're gonna get to play through and figure out the story of kind of how he's gotten back to where he is now. The Temple of Earth in the center is also going to play a huge part in that role. And like we mentioned, this is the central hub. So there's actually going to be portals in Deepholm that will take you to Vashjr, to Hyjal, Twilight Highlands, and Uldum, and you'll be able to go back and forth between those as a quick form of travel.
Deepholm was actually planned to be a major hub for Cataclysm, much like the portal room in Dalaran, with us using the place as a way to teleport to all the other zones. And it makes sense too, as we'd be working to repair the damage Deathwing did so we could possibly imprison him again. Although, going a completely other way of the story, Deepholm was not used, even though it had plenty of room amongst its side rooms for everything that a hub would need. It was obviously designed to house a whole bunch of portals, but only ended up having about 1 or 2. Vashjr easily is one of the biggest zones for scrap stuff, so we got a lot here to cover. First, the water combat was going to be overhauled in order to make the zone much more enjoyable.
We will make sure that it is not annoying to play underwater.
That never happened. Instead, Blizzard just ended up launching Vashjr as is, and cut all future underwater content they had planned. Originally, the focus was supposed to be the city, with the sunken city of Vashjr.
After the Sundering hit, and water flooded Azeroth, it actually ended up on the sea floor, and it's been down there for a number of years, and only recently has it just started to come to light with the Cataclysm.
However, that never really happened, the city we arrived to only being an extremely minor part of the full story for the subsection of one of the zones. Continue on with Vashjr, we have a few things about the ancient gods there. The giant shelled beast there, who, fun fact, used the Cthulhu model as their eyeball. These creatures were meant to be so much more, and there was a lot cut about them. so let's go over this.
We're also planning to have selected areas in Vashjr that are actually indoor, kind of like these big, there's creatures down there that no one really knows a lot about it yet, but they're ancient, and they've been there for a long time, and we're going to find out what's happening with them through the quest flow in the zone.
First off, we were supposed to have far less water sections with the zone originally, with water being a majority, but not all of it. A good portion of this would be spent inside these Naga cities, situated within these shells, shown originally in this bit of concept art. Second, we were supposed to find an old god corrupted version of one of these gods, a twisted amalgamation of undersea life, acting as the end boss of the zone. However, this was moved to the Abyssal Maw raid to act as one of its bosses, and as mentioned before, that never came out. Third, we were actually supposed to have a major hub within one of these ancient gods, as when we arrived to some of the Naga, they've turned them into their home bases, and so we would do the same, possibly even making it a major city. However, with the layout of the inner shell, I totally understand why they cut it. A giant circle-shaped city with no buildings and no flying sounds horrible. Also, spending all day inside a fish's body doesn't sound very fun. And enough about a zone full of fish. Fishing was supposed to be updated with little events and special quests. However, this would not come to fruition. At least till Legion, when we finally got at least some little fishing events with the baits and special fish, as well as the fishing artifact with its own little questline, scenario, and artifact tree. That required quite the long grind in order to max out. Uldum originally was supposed to be a zone focused on the Explorers League and the newly founded Reliquary fighting it off against each other for the most powerful artifacts. Of course, leaning more into archaeology, as these two factions were the archaeological factions, and the zone itself is an ancient Egyptian zone, so it was perfect, all over a giant superweapon. Although instead, Blizzard seemingly scrapped this storyline, rather late too, shoving in instead a whole bunch of Indiana Jones references. Rather well shown by the fact it is the zone with by far the least voice acting, and the least serious out of all the zones, overall acting as a failed comedy more than a compelling story. Ever since the Cataclysm beta, we've had a few unused voice lines, first of those being the unused traitors. In Cataclysm, you find within your ranks traitors, members of the Twilight Hammer who've infiltrated the factions. Archbishop Benedictus was planned to be the Alliance traitor, and Grand Magister Romoth was planned to be the Horde traitor.
Romoth, you stand accused of high treason to Silvermoon, and of being a member of the Twilight Council.
Ah, the long knives come out. Is there proof to these accusations?
This document. It's your handwriting. I'd recognize it anywhere.
You leave me no choice, then. It's a pity, really. I had plans for our people. There is a war coming, and I've chosen to be on the winning side.
You disgust me, traitor!
You forced my hand a little early, perhaps. But I think you'll find I'm still playing from a position of strength! Feel my wrath!
However, they seem to have dropped this idea early on and scrapped both of them, only to then use the idea anyway, except instead of the Horde traitor being Romoth, they instead gave the role to a random nobody named Saranok the Mystic. Romoth in lore is a blood elf who was a staunch Kel'Thas supporter, and didn't change his mind on him until later on in the Burning Crusade, but was shown to be very loyal to Lor'themar after he decided to change his mind, and so his betrayal didn't make much sense. Although they could have just easily said he was pretending to be loyal to Lor'themar to gain his trust, but honestly it could have gone either way. Onto some more voice lines. We have voice lines from Bane speaking on the gate, that being the Great Gate, the massive gate that separates the Northern Barrens from Mulgore.
Open the gate! I will not let a single human step past me into Mulgore! My people will not be harmed! Sound the drums of war! For Taurajo!
This event seemingly having been in retaliation to the Alliance's attack on Camp Taurajo. However, with Bane taking a very small role in Cataclysm, it seems they may have intended for him to take a larger role, especially after his father's death. But as soon as they did bring him to the story, they seemingly gave him a full 180 from their original idea, as he was staunchly against any kind of retaliation against the Alliance. This explains quite well why there's this massive detailed wall to Mulgore that is used for literally nothing. This could have been an extremely epic moment with him opening the gate to unleash Tauren armies upon the Alliance within the Barrens. However, instead, the Orcs simply kicked the Alliance out of the Southern Barrens on their own later on.
As I know it's kind of daunting to think, oh, I have to enchant my thing, and I have to put gems in it, and now I have to reforge it. But reforging is going to be relatively cheap on the scale of things, so you will need someone to do it, and it's going to be given to blacksmiths, leatherworkers, tailors, jewel crafters, and engineers. And so each one of those professions gets a specific chunk of items that they get to reforge. For example, blacksmiths get to do plate and weapons, and engineers would do trinkets and ranged weapons.
Originally, Reforging was going to be a profession thing instead of being an ethereal trader. You would need to go to a player with profession relevant to the piece of gear to enchant it in a way. A jewel crafter to reforge your rings or necklaces, haste into mastery, a tailor to do so with your cloth, a scribe for your staff, offhand, and trinkets, a blacksmith for your weapon or plate armor, leatherworker for your leather, engineer for your ranged weapons. You get the deal. However, this was scrapped in preference for just an NPC. As with each new piece of gear, you'd have to go out, buy new gems and chants, and then find various different players to reforge all your gear to get the exact hit/expertise cap. Would be kind of exhausting. Cthulhu was one of the most interesting old gods, and so Blizzard planned to bring him back. Within Cho'Gall's and Medan's storyline in the comics, Cho'Gall captured and forced Medan to resurrect the old god's corpse. And since at this point Medan was still planned to be part of the game, and had yet to be scrapped, this lined up perfectly with Cho'Gall planning to be a major villain in the expansion, even being a raid boss for the Bastion of Twilight. Although this never happened as Medan and his comics were abandoned, and then later retconned. However, in the alpha you would get whispers from Cthulhu and Silthus, implying his possible return. Overall, Cataclysm feels like it would have been done far better if it was split into 2 expansions, with one focused on the Twilight Hammer and the followers in Azoth, with it then leading into Deathwing into the Firelands. Maybe it had been done that way, far less of the content would have been cut, and we could have seen so much more.